All right. Welcome to Exceptional Circumstances for Exceptional Learners. This is our second episode, and it is of the utmost important and in the timeliness of matters that we are talking about the impact of COVID-19 and all of the recovery plans that are coming out, and really to focus on what does this mean for our students and our teachers. Since this is a global site, if you're not aware about Learning Revolution, it is a wonderful hub for so many different topics. I hope that you were able to join and possibly get involved in some of the other groups. This one today specifically, we are going to be talking about the recovery plans, but trying to focus on special education. For some of you, I'm curious to know if your country has already returned and what that has been like. What are some of the questions that are being sent to you in order for your communities to kind of get back to a place where school is in session? And just what's the general buzz of what I'm hearing and from the kind of initial conversation that we started at the beginning of this session? There's these guidelines, and now it's up to districts, and they need to be able to decide what's best for their communities. Well, who is getting a voice? Are parents involved? And to stay focused on kind of the purpose of our group, how are special education students being considered in these guidelines? So to kind of just get a sense of where you're coming from and what some of the concerns you have, if you could go to slido.com and put in the code 10902. What that is going to have you do is if you go to the poll, all right, basically, what are some things that you are concerned about regarding the reopening of schools? So if I'm going to give you guys, you can put as many things as you want, as I know many things come to mind, but this will kind of help us to guide the conversation further. So I'm going to put a timer on for 3 minutes and just give you some time to think and to get those down. About 30 seconds left. Seeing a lot of things to do with safety, the schedule. All right, so just gonna kind of scroll down. Feel free to continue to add to this as we kind of go through things. I, for one, am not an expert. I'm a teacher just like the rest of you. I'm someone who is very concerned that we're jumping into things too quickly. I've been all over Facebook groups and just trying to see what is going on out there, and specifically to gather the information so that we can advocate in our own communities. So I'm seeing a lot of things pop up that I think have gone through all of our minds. You know, self-care for the teachers, that's so important. We talked a little bit about that last episode. Just the trauma, the emotional impact, evaluations, professional development, the parents, thinking about our communities in the rural places. You know, how can we help them to have access to the same type of education? Oh, there's just so much. So this will be something that, like I said, you feel free to continue to write questions. I certainly do not have all the answers, but we can try our very best together to at least create a community of support during this kind of unsure time. All right. So thank you for your feedback. So just to kind of go over what we're doing today. So one of the guidelines that came out that I found interesting was the American Academy of Pediatrics. I did my best to try to summarize the guidelines with special attention to special needs. So we'll go through that. Part 2 today, since I'm in the state of New Jersey, that's kind of where a lot of my information was coming from. So through some of the NJEA websites and what have you, I have a presenter here today. Lauren Coleman is going to help us kind of sort through some of the Jersey guidelines, as I feel like many of the states are similar. And then what are some of the concerns that we have regarding that? Part 3, if there is anyone here from another country, I would love to see what you have done. I've tried to find kind of some of the basic things that are available online, but you know, this is not just our state. It's not just the country. This is a global thing. So what are we doing, and how can we you know, help to advocate for our communities? And lastly, just the overall impact, and what I saw just from the initial questions that you all have, you know, the safety and the well-being of not just the students, but the teachers too. At any part, feel free to chime in. I do want more of a discussion. There's just so much information. I apologize for some of the text heavy slides, but I did the best that I could. All right, so one of the first things that I came across was March 16th. This was a fact sheet that was put out by the Department of Ed. And what I did, if you're familiar with this, I copied the entire doc and I put it into a word cloud. To see what words are coming up the most. What were we concerned about on March 16th when this all kind of first started? Because at the end of the day, we also have to, education is a right. So how are we making sure that this happens? So just take a few seconds. Feel free to unmute your mic. What do you see in this visual that sticks out to you?
One thing that pops out to me right away, after reading the biggest words, I started jumping down to the middle-sized words. In the far right, almost below like the bite out of the apple, is free appropriate public education. And that is something that I think is going to be very interesting, because other words that are popping out to me that are mid-sized are race, color, disabilities. And starting to look at the guidelines, when you're reviewing the guidelines right now, it seems like there's a general plan, but I haven't seen a lot of specialized sub plans yet about what to do for students or for populations that might generate a cause for greater differentiation or more specified guidelines. And maybe it's going to be up to the specific towns and districts to release those because they know their populations best. But that's going to be something where we have some general guidelines to start, but how is it going to serve all the learners and guarantee that we are delivering?
Great point. Anyone else see something that has really stuck out to them? Does anyone see staff on there? I know that this was for the students, but that's something that has come up in a lot of the groups, that while there's a lot out there, well, what about the people who have to serve the students? Now, students, nice and big, it's right there. That's what this is about. It's why we're all here. But when it comes to something like this, you know, how do we ensure our safety as well? Raised hand. Go ahead, Roberta.
Yeah, I think what you're mentioning is really critical. My perspective is a little different because I'm at the college rather than K through 12. But in general, in terms of how we serve our students, I find that there's still not sufficient emphasis being placed on professional development and what professional development opportunities exist. It seems like we're supposed to volunteer for them. I don't know many of my colleagues who are being compensated for the extra time required for the professional development. And I think that the lack of professional development and proper contingency planning resulted in what I prefer to call crisis education, as opposed to distance or remote education. So we have a situation now where many teachers feel that remote or distance education is not education, that it can't possibly be quality. And therefore, you know, are clamoring to go back into the classroom. And even though that may not be safe for anybody, the training the teachers require to provide quality distance education or remote education is still severely lacking.
I 100% agree. We have some agrees from the message board too. You know, on a dime, we had to take our plans and just make it work. And I like, you're the first person that I've heard call it crisis education. And it truly was what it came down to. Because for some of my students who had grandparents who were sick, who had parents working, you know, shifts at the hospitals or on SEPTA and were a part of the essential workers, how can I justify teaching you quadratic equations when you're worried about getting your next meal? And a lot of that did come down to it. And I think that as a whole, we saw that schools are not just about the reading and the writing. Schools do so much more. And for people that weren't aware of that, that maybe had the privilege to not be aware of that, when they realized that schools had to do with food too, and the services, like the services is a pretty big one there. A lot of our students with special needs weren't getting the OT, the behavioral services and things that were essential to their growth, and many of them have regressed. So it's just something to really think about. I really like the idea of crisis education. Trying to keep up with the message board as well. Yeah, it's almost like we do need to retrain. So let's go a little bit further because we could get caught here for hours. So the American Academy of Pediatrics strongly advocates that all policy considerations for the coming school year should start with a goal of having students physically present in school. That sounds lovely. And if you're reading that from a Facebook post and you're not in the education world, you see that and go, all right, it's safe. But if you read further, all right, I tried to get through the text and didn't want to just have slides. So what I did was try to pull out the important information. And so what I see is flexible, that these strategies can be revised and adapted, that they should be practical, feasible, appropriate for the child and adolescent's developmental stage. That doesn't mean age. That means where they are developmentally, which means something very different in the special ed world. All right. Thinking about the diversity with medically fragile, those that live in poverty, developmental challenges, special health care needs, disabilities, what it means for them to return to school safely might look a lot different from the larger population. At the same time, let's not exclude them because you're not allowed to by the law. But now I'm seeing this collaboration piece that pediatricians and families and schools, they should have been connecting together before. Now it's of the utmost importance and almost feels like it's a mandatory thing. And then furthermore, we're talking about the overall health, the well-being of not just the children, but the families, the communities, and this consistent communication in all the languages. Now, this to me just sounds like what should be happening every day, right? That we're flexible and that we're thinking about individual needs of each kid. But if you've worked in education for a while, you notice that sometimes there's a lot of red tape and that there's a lot of things that we don't always, even though we would like to, give the absolute best, and we legally should. Sometimes if there's not a person advocating for that student, they might get lost in the system. And that's something that is very important to think about your individual kids. So now there's a lot more of the recommendations. They break it down by age group, but I tried to focus just on the exceptional learners. So just like Lauren brought up, the free and appropriate education is what the law states. And I wanted to highlight that it may not be feasible, depending on the needs of the individual child and adolescents, to adhere to both the distancing guidelines and the criteria in the IEP. Therefore, everything has to be case by case, which brings up, especially for special education teachers, psychologists, the case workers, the child study team, a lot more work, right? A lot more communication, and a lot more that can happen before we even think about school, which September is not that far away. And for some of you, I know like Georgia, they open on August 3rd. So that is just insane to me to think about. Um, the impact of instructional time. We also have to start thinking about there's going to be some academic loss. But for kids that maybe weren't identified yet, how do we tell if it's lost because of COVID-19 or is it lost because there's a learning need that we need to address? And what about those kids who weren't quite classified yet? What does that look like? I think a lot of, if there's anybody here who is a service provider, I know that some of the therapies were able to happen online, but many couldn't reach the student or it wasn't effective. So there's a lot of things, and a lot of the therapies, in order to be effective, have to happen in close proximity. And so when you're thinking about that and social distance guidelines, can we still be as effective? So a lot of this does also come down to the almighty dollar bill. Just in as of last night at 4 p.m., some of the senators introduced a bill to provide emergency IDEA funding. So they are aware that it's going to cost money. So it's being called the Supporting Children with Disabilities During COVID-19 Act. There is $11 billion in grants available. 400 million are for the preschool, 500 million are for the infant and toddler programs, and 300 million is being designated for that professional development. This is something that I think we definitely are going to have to bring up the senators and to make sure that something like this gets put into action. I'm noticing an emphasis on the younger kids, but I'm a little bit concerned, where is that middle group? I know there's other monies out there. If you were up to date on what is happening with DeVos, she had guidelines for how schools could use the monies in the CARES Act. Those guidelines, as of, I believe, last week, are now rules that we also have to include not just public education, but private schools as well. So let's just leave that one out there for what it is. I could talk about this in a complete show. So does anybody have any reactions or things to say regarding the last few slides?
I'm really excited to see about this new act that they're going to try to have the senators introduce. It's interesting to see how much money they have, and particularly how much is going to early intervention. But when I think about my schools in particular, what we need, I feel, is just generally more space. When we think about social distancing, we need either a greater number of classrooms or a greater number of teachers. And while money would be fabulous, it also takes time. And we just don't have the time to do that either. Like, there's no time to reconfigure the actual physical layout of the building. That would be a construction project or a renovation project. We also don't really have that much time before school starts to acquire this money and then to put it into additional staff members, which could be helpful for social distancing. So while I think it's great, I don't know if it's going to hit the needs that many classrooms will desire.
And then also there's many teachers that I fear that people are going to start to leave the world of education because they're scared. And I don't blame them, especially if you have, there's things in the guidelines stating, you don't have to return if you have certain medical issues and this and that. And at the end of the day, what is important? Like, I want to go back. For me, I personally have asthma. I've had a couple of bad years and I'm scared. I love my job. I love what I do. I love my school. But to say that I'm not worried about myself in addition to God forbid, one of my kids and I spread it and I gave it to them, I can't even begin to think about it. But Lauren, I think this is a great time to kind of go into what you were able to do. So I took the New Jersey guidelines, and I did the same thing with the word cloud. You'll see students is number one. We see staff is there. They're talking about us. We want the learning, but there's a lot of the information. There's so much we still don't know. So going through the document, which I think, how many pages was it? 104?
Yes, our state gave out 104 pages of guidelines. So in full disclosure, I made it through about the first 80 really reading. And then I kind of like lost steam and skimmed my way through the tail end of it. But I tried to give it a good look over.
So what Lauren did and how I got in contact with her is she posted the summarized guidelines. There are 36, I believe, different sections that the guideline went over. I was happy to see that social emotional learning did make its way. Special ed has its own little block. But I guess I would love for you to talk about some of the things that you encountered and what you, and she put a link to the document in the chat. You know, what was surprising? What has been some of the conversation that you've had on social media because of it? And the floor is yours.
Oh, awesome. So a little bit of background about me. I am a middle school teacher. I've taught language arts in my building, and I've also taught for the last couple of years the computer elective courses at our middle school level. So I'm sort of like a specials teacher. And in July, starting actually today, I've stepped up to be on the executive board of my local school union. So for that reason, I felt an obligation to really read these guidelines and start to be prepared with what they said in case our union membership starts to ask questions over the summer. So last Friday, the governor of New Jersey, partnering with the NJ Department of Education, released the 104 pages of guidelines. And I started reading through them, and I tried to turn them into a spreadsheet of like buzzwords and short one-line quotations that I thought teachers would want to see. So I see Rebecca's opening it up. And it wound up still being very long. Like my goal was to make like an easily skimmable document, but I just felt like there was so much there that this is still a pretty comprehensive spreadsheet, even though I was hoping this was going to be like the Cliff Notes version of it. And one of the biggest takeaways that I noticed is that these guidelines for New Jersey offer an idealized situation of what they highly recommend that you should do. But then they also tell you that if you can't make that work due to physical space or maybe due to budget cuts, then it's okay not to do that. And that was where I kind of had some surprise. So Rebecca, like if you can scroll down a little bit to the busing section.
Yeah.
This was one where I was like, oh my gosh. So in column C, like where it says optional recommendations, ideally you're supposed to have 11 students on a full-sized 54-person bus. That is the CDC recommendation. That means putting one child in each row and also skipping rows where you're leaving rows completely open. But then it goes on to say, if you cannot do that, it's okay because other states like Montana are putting one child in every row. And then it says also, if you can afford to buy partitions to put in between seats, you can fill the bus up to 44 students. It even goes on to say, if you have children wearing masks on the bus, you can put all 454 students on there, like just fill it regularly. So I thought this was interesting because like there is a best case situation. The best case is 11 students on the bus. They would not need to wear masks if they're spread out, and the bus should be disinfected after every route. But if you don't have enough buses, enough bus drivers, or enough budgeting, you can fill the buses with 54 students, have everybody in a mask, and also the buses should be disinfected once per day. So like there's so much deviance or like, you know, like depending on how schools and their school building leaders choose to interpret these rules, schools can go in a very, very safe manner where they're being extremely cautious and they're definitely going to be doing all that they can to guarantee safety. But I can imagine even schools who have best intentions, either running short of staff members, not having enough personnel, or not having enough budget to implement everything as carefully as they could. Because almost every category of my school reopening plan sort of talks about this. There's an idealized best way to do it, but if you can't do it, then the school still, like, the guidelines still say that your school should reopen and offer some degree of in-person education no matter what.
Now, I'm thinking very specifically about students that take the special education bus who have paraprofessionals with them because they need them to get on and off because of wheelchairs and what have you. I saw in the pediatrics one that adults aren't allowed on the bus because kids don't spread it as often as adults do. So now what does that even mean? So it's almost, while we want to make it free and appropriate, now because you can't get to school, sorry, you're going to have to do homeschool because that's going to be the best option. Okay, so like, what do we do with that? Because even in the pediatrics, a lot of things, well, we would like you to take a temperature, but because COVID doesn't always start with a fever, that might not be the best thing. So there's nothing solid about what we need to do. And so much pressure is being placed on the districts and the administrators to make these big calls. So yeah, I once again, a lot more questions, not a lot of answers.
No, and I'm seeing Natalie in the chat mention that, I believe she said she was in New Mexico, that they're pushing for remote learning. Here in New Jersey, we were told that our plan cannot be 100% remote. We can choose to either do fully in-person, or we can offer some kind of hybrid. The hybrid might involve some students coming in on certain days while other students stay home, like a rotating schedule. Besides being a New Jersey teacher, I'm also a content developer for a series of early literacy and middle school literacy games. I work for a company called Squiggle Park, and our literacy games are used by teachers across North America. So it's been really interesting to see how people in Squiggle Park's marketing department have been talking with other teachers. My team includes a teacher from Virginia, a teacher from Nova Scotia, and we also work closely with a teacher from British Columbia. So it's been interesting to see how, depending on where you're located, some places are back in school entirely. In Canada, Quebec and British Columbia opened up in person before summer vacation, and they went back. In other places, they're being told also that there's going to be at least some component of in-person learning. Virginia also starts with staff back in the buildings August 3rd, and they're told that they're opening. So I don't know what will be decided down the road. Like right now, we're planning to go back in some regard. We have a little bit of time. So I don't know, Rebecca, if you were seeing this, but in some of the New Jersey teacher groups or in our union groups, people are wondering if things will change as it gets closer, if we have an uptick of cases, or if we see, trends changing nationally, if we'll choose to prioritize remote learning now. But our school building leaders have until July 30th to create a plan that meets the 104 pages of guidelines. They have to submit by July 30th to the NJDOE for approval. So they have to move forward with what they have now.
Roberta, I saw that you had raised your hand.
Yeah, I understood Natalie's comments a little differently. I understood her to be, I think it was Natalie. I understood her to be saying that we're going to realize that we can't live up to the guidelines and therefore have to go back to remote. One of the problems in New York, which I suspect is a problem elsewhere, is that the guidelines themselves are a moving target. And that's because COVID is also a moving target. Mm-hmm. So after the guidelines were issued a few days ago, Governor Cuomo said that the AC systems, the HVAC systems have to meet certain standards for the malls. So I've heard teachers say, well, if it has to meet those standards for the malls, I imagine that it has to meet those standards for school buildings as well. So in my school, for example, where they thought they could meet some of the guidelines, now they're saying, I don't think we can meet it because we can't do this with our HVAC system. So we've been planning for a few weeks to go in one direction, and now there's a roadblock to that direction. But the other thing I wanted to say is that, my students are adults. Many of them are realizing for the first time that they have learning challenges because they have to deal with technology that they were not totally dependent on before. So they've never had the experience of a parent advocating for them. They don't know how to begin to advocate. And while we have an active Office of Accessibility, the office is not reaching out. They're not saying, come to us. So because I've worked with that office in the past, I knew to alert my students, and I tell all of them, I don't ask them, who's having a problem. I tell all of them, this is where the office is, this is the contact information, etc. But I think that's also a problem across the board, that with what we've had to do in order to be in a more healthy environment, there are probably a lot more, and I think it might have been Lauren who mentioned it, there are more children now who are exceptional, who need services that they never had, that their parents never had to seek out before. And there needs to be publicity, to the general public about where these services can be found and what students are entitled to, because it's not just I would like to have, it's an entitlement. But there's no publicity being given to that.
Yes, absolutely. And these guidelines do raise a lot of concerns. I don't think Sarah was able to join us today, but this document, once again, it's New Jersey, just because that is my field of reference right now. But if you click on this link, you'll see that this is an ongoing document that has over 300 questions that people are having and are submitting, of course, questions without a lot of answers. But, it's really important, if you do live in a state with an active union, that you're talking to the right people for yourself, but also, to make sure that we do this well. I think it is a really interesting time where these issues that we're seeing have been here for a long time. Now we just can't ignore them. So like one of the recommendations for the air, you mentioned the HVAC, is that we keep windows open as often as possible and all doors open so that you aren't in contact with the metal on the door. Well, if I have asthma and I have an air filter in a room, that's not going to work for me. Additionally, we spent the last, oh boy, how many years working on active shooter protocol, which in the past year was keep your door closed. So the most positive thing that has come out of COVID-19 is that we haven't had a school shooting. I don't want to make this, about that, but it made me think what's going to happen, because schools had other issues than just COVID-19. So, how are we really considering the overall safety, and that we're not just putting guidelines out there because they look nice, and then actually we're saying, hey, principal, we really just want you to keep everybody home still, but we can't say that politically speaking. Is that what is going on? I don't know. I do want to keep moving forward. I do want to hear all of your conversations. But so far, this is what I've been able to gather. In Connecticut, it's every child, every day. Georgia goes back on August 3rd. Parent and teacher or parents and the teachers have a choice as to whether or not they want to go back. They have to commit for 9 weeks. Teachers need to have it documented that there is a legitimate reason, and those are also indicated under the CDC guidelines. There are high priority things such as diabetes, but then there's some things that they're not sure of, like asthma could or could not. It's kind of like depending on you and your doctor. New Mexico, 2 days face-to-face, 3 days online. Jersey, we won't know until a month before school exactly what is going on. West Virginia, as far as I know, has nothing. Kentucky has been district by district. Texas has been radio silence. Most of them need to have some decision by the end of July. In Education Week, I was able to look up some of the global issues or what they're doing on a global stance. So New South Wales on May 11th opened 1 day a week. In Denmark, they started these enclaves, which means they basically have a class, a bubble. The kids stay in one class, and that's been going well. Taiwan, they had to wear masks at all times, and as a country, they really hit it hard in the beginning, so their rates have maintained and been low. They also are providing 9 masks to all students and teachers every 2 weeks and implementing temperature screening before school. South Korea started with their high school students, and by June 1st, they started to slowly bring the middle school and the younger schools back. Austria is doing 2 cohorts, so kind of like the A-B schedule. And in Israel, they have a max limit of 17 students per class. Anybody else out there right now from another country that wants to chime in? I think we had mostly US today. I had somebody in the beginning, but I think they've since logged off. It's always hard to figure out the time
Another blue sheet
difference.
to do for me. Now I have 3 more,
Okay.
but that's all that I'm getting today, I think.
So I did hear from a dear friend from Kenya. So just some pictures. This is what it's starting to look like as kids go back. I believe this was China, the top one. They actually made these 6-foot distance hats, and you'll see that they all have masks on. For some of the high school kids, you know, you have to all be facing front, which I know most of my classes, we work in small groups, so that's making me rethink a lot of things, and also just the prep work that goes into starting to think about what a classroom looks like. So this is my friend Joseph. He is from the Maasai tribe in Kenya. When you're talking about rural, that is exactly what they are, because they are nomadic. He was supposed to come on today. However, he said that he has no lights right now. And he came in after a long day attending another village discussing the impacts and the effects of the COVID-19 epidemic. So here are people who have to walk quite a distance to get to schools. They're having the same issues, the connectability, getting the getting the resources and the computers. Right now, I've started a GoFundMe for his village to be able to get the masks, to get the hand sanitizer, the wash basins, because a lot of what they do as a nomadic tribe is they barter and trade. Well, all of the borders have shut down. Nobody wants another person's cow right now. So when you think about that, we sometimes get caught in our bubbles here. And I think it's important to think back to the global aspect. So unfortunately, he cannot be with us, but he did share a lot of the same things and concerns that we have. You know, what do we do about this education loss now? How do we make up for the lost time and also keep pushing our kids forward so that they don't fall behind and drop out? And one of the things that comes up so much is this idea of stress. This is a really great tool. I will post this slide in the group. So if you have not joined Exceptional Circumstances group on Learning Revolution page, I urge you to do so. And what's interesting about this, when we're talking about the content of stress, you know, we're talking about an individual, their self, but we also have to consider the students that we care for. So already as a special education teacher, you're at a higher point in the stress grid with all of the regulations and the paperwork and everything else that is going to come out of these guidelines. We really need to look out for one another. If you haven't had a chance to check this out, I know I was somewhere from the purple to the blue section. And I'm concerned. I have a young son at home who dealt with a lot of also asthma type condition prior to COVID. I'm concerned, you know? So, you know, I want us to keep connecting. We have about 10 minutes, so I would love just to open this up for discussion. I very much want us to stay connected. If you do go to learningrevolution.com and join the group, there is a section to continue discussions and to connect. It sounds like we are a pretty diverse group of individuals, and I think that we can gain a lot from talking to one another. And if not for anything else, for the mental health aspect of connection. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and just open this up for discussion.
Thanks, Becca. One thing that I didn't see just in quickly perusing the guidelines, is there going to be more enhanced mental health support for both staff and students when and if we come back into the building? And even if we don't, even to do it remotely for students who can't come back?
From what I've read, it says encouraged and that they're going to have it, but to what capacity? We have, like, I know in Jersey, we have the Educator Assistance Program. So they're encouraging those, but what about states that maybe don't have that set up already or as strong? I'm not positive. I know that it's being encouraged, but you know, what does that mean?
Right. What does that look like, and who's going to be doing the service providing? But we don't have enough in the schools as it is, and certainly going forward, we're going to need a lot more.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
New Jersey, the buzzword for that is called wraparound services, which is very interesting because there's a whole section of the guidelines that talks about providing mental health resources for students and staff, but it also talks about becoming maybe a primary care provider, potentially offering dental services, as well as other things such as, you know, daycare services, greater family engagement, expanding before school aftercare and summer programs, as well as that mentoring component that I posted about in the chat. That's not something that I put very detailed into my personal guidelines spreadsheet, because as a teacher, I don't think those wraparound services will come from me necessarily or fall onto my staff. But I did think it was interesting how schools should now be thinking about a greater degree of health provisions, not just mental health, but also just, you know, physical health and things of that nature as well. So they have that in the original guidelines. I'll put the link in the chat. They briefly mention it on page 10. And then they have like a whole bunch of information once you get around page 30 of the guidelines. So I'll post that link.
Great, thank you. Yeah, and I definitely will try to take as much from this wonderful chat discussion. I think that it is important for us to kind of see that. So I'll try to do something with that on the page as well so we can kind of continue. All right, I'm going to go back to our original questions here. From the Slido deck. All right, so we have, how can schools support students that have social emotional needs? Some of the tribal communities in New Mexico absolutely were hit hard, and they lost, the children lost loved ones. How can we support those students? I mean, for a long time, I feel like the answer has been we need more, right? You need more mental health. We need more counselors. We need to emphasize not just the value of the academics, but we need to start to value emotions too. And that's been something that has been my soapbox since I started. And that is so important, and I hope that like this has uncovered the things that have always been true. Now we can't avoid them. I just saw somebody posted within the chat talking about what happens if somebody gets the virus. So that is such an interesting concept. The only thing that I've seen so far is Bucks County in Pennsylvania put out their frequently asked questions because one of them with the pediatric guidelines, while 6 feet is recommended, 3 feet is okay. So a lot of the parents are concerned with that. Well, I'm not okay with just okay. So I know that there's some frequently asked question guides out there. It is also, you know, it's going to be up to service providers and doctors and people being honest. And I fear we're going to push to get back, and then we're all going to be back to ground zero here, where we're going to start from scratch. Why not invest in doing this well? Doing the distance and learning thing well, because to be honest, there's going to be some kids that aren't returning because they simply can't. So how can we do this well instead of just rushing and getting it done? And the fact that, Roberta, I think you said it in the beginning, we're putting more attention into casinos and bars. This should be a crisis top priority to get our kids back to school, not just because we want to have the parents go back to work so the economy's back. That's important, okay? But let's think about the whole picture. Sorry, I'm getting, money, money, money. I see that, Eric, and it's true. We're not putting the emphasis where it matters. And that is, you know, there's so much misinformation out there. If we don't start like the bill that is being put on the Senate floor for the funding, that came from something that started at the beginning of March from the Council of Exceptional Children, which they worked with over 5,000 grassroots organizations for anything to get done and to be done well. Sometimes you got to be the squeaky wheel, and it comes from grassroots. It comes from local communities. We have to advocate because you know your kids best. You do. And you know yourself best. You need to be comfortable going to a building each day and giving of yourself. If you're not, the education's still going to suffer. And I just feel like you know, without these groups and without the conversation, if we just allow the politics to run what happens, if we just allow the people from the top to tell us what to do, some of the soldiers, us, are going to have some consequences. And I think that we need to stand up for our kids and for ourselves. I also have heard that, you know, kids just don't get it. But we also don't know enough about the virus. We're learning that it affects kidneys and brains and all kinds of things. We just don't know enough. And I don't think we've been in this position in an information age where we simply just don't know. I wish I had a wonderful thing to send to you and say, okay, and now we're good. But this is really the beginning. I can send you some positive vibes and to just know that I'm available for conversation and that the group, it's not just about me. This is about the collective. And so if you come across a resource, I know every day my computer has about 1,000 tabs, and that's how my brain feels too. And there's too much to pay attention to. So if we can all do a little part, and if you do go to Learning Revolution, right? If you go into our show, Exceptional and Learners are right here. All right. You can become a member, and then through that we can communicate. In addition to that, all of the recordings are going to be available on here as soon as they're available. And then I have a resources tab, which I will try to summarize the episode and put all the links that were in the chat box. And then furthermore, we have discussion. So what are some of your main concerns? The Office of Special Education has put out a ton of webinars that are just a lot of information for the families and the teachers. It's overwhelming, but if you find one that's really great, if you want to add that to the discussion group, there's also, you know, anytime you come across a webinar that you want to share, feel free to add that. We can also add more discussions as things come up. So I'm really hoping that this will be a hub for us to continue the conversation, share stories, and just be there for one another. Next week's show, this will happen every Wednesday at 2 p.m. Next week's show is going to be about the importance of art and music for children with special needs and what that looks like in a COVID-19 environment. So yeah, I'm so sorry to hear that, Geraldine. That's really tough. And I hope that, you know, you can bring some of the discussion and some of the resources that are happening in other states to hopefully help you where you are. So stay connected. The goal of this is to navigate, accommodate, and continue to advocate, because without that, you know, our kids can't get what they need. So thank you again, and hopefully I'll see you in the weeks to come.